Taft, Montana, often referred to as the wickedest city in the West, sat nestled in the Bitterroot Mountains near modern-day Lookout Pass. Although the label city may be a bit of a stretch, the half-mile-long tent and shanty grouping was host to the laborers of the nation's most expensive railroading feat yet, the St. Paul Pass Tunnel, a 1.66-mile tunnel through the hard rock of the Bitterroot Mountains on the Idaho-Montana border. As tended to be the case, loose industry follows these work camps, and before the town had even found its name, it became home to numerous saloons, gambling dens, and brothels, boasting a murder rate higher than contemporary New York and Chicago combined. Beginning as nothing more than a scattered bunch of basic work camps, the quickly growing region was already earning a reputation for lawlessness. And following disputes between miners' unions and mine owners, and the dynamiting death of former Idaho Governor Steunenberg, the area would receive a visit from U.S. War Secretary and future President William Howard Taft. Taft's visit was anything but cordial, and rather than attempt to garner votes from the locals he detested, he opted to instead attempt to shame them, calling the town a blight on the American landscape, and its inhabitants the scourge of society. In turn, the drunken crowd cheered the irate secretary, and upon his departure, determined the perfect name for the town Secretary Taft seemed so fond of was his own, and thus, Taft, Montana. For its existence, Taft never had much in the way of law enforcement. As it was only accessible by train much of the year, regular patrol was near impossible. Missoula being the nearest town with a real police force being 90 miles away, response time left something to be desired. As the town was built on national forest land, it was subject to federal rules and regulations, but the only federal law enforcement anywhere nearby were the forest rangers, who were quickly overwhelmed by the immense undertaking trying to manage the seeming flood of heathens into the area. Appeals to higher authority for guidance would prove largely useless, with one forest ranger writing to the regional office, "There are 2 undesirable prostitutes setting up business on Forest Service land. What should I do?" To which he received the careful guidance, "Find 2 desirable ones." In his search he would have had many choices. Prostitution was the second leading profession in town, with claims reaching over 500 prostitutes in a town of less than 3,000. The town saw nearly no family presence, with up to 50 saloons at the peak, but never a church, school, or a fire department. Alcohol being in great supply and the ultimate accelerant to turn words to violence, Taft saw far greater than its fair share of Wild West bar fights turned shootouts. One account of the bloodshed comes from a woman who had stopped in Taft after a snowslide delayed their train. She claimed as she walked down the sidewalk through town, there were many arms and legs sticking out of the snowbanks outside saloons. As the snow is deep and the ground frozen, the dead were pitched into the snow until spring thaw, when they could be properly buried. The melting of the snow would also reveal more unknown victims in the area surrounding the town, with 8 men being found in the spring thaw of 1909 alone. All suffered bullet or knife wounds. A large part of the conflicts that would arise came from the general misunderstanding. Language and cultural barriers would be inevitable. One journalist wrote the town's population contained Swedes, Italians, Chinese, Australians, boys seeking their fortunes, gamblers, farmers, prostitutes, disappointed miners from the Alaskan gold rush, wastrels, college men, uneducated laborers, the last of the Old West gunmen, Minnesota lumberjacks, and French-Canadian woodsmen. The town also housed a large number of Montenegrin laborers famous for their rock drilling. The Montenegrin population looked to one man as their leader, whom they referred to as King. While the man wasn't a true monarch, he would handle negotiations and acted as their representative. In the fall of 1907, the king would get into a shouting match with Reddy Hayes, a tunnel foreman over work conditions. According to Reddy, the argument devolved and the king went for his pistol, but Reddy beat him to it and killed the king in claimed self-defense. After the shooting, Reddy would immediately hop on an eastbound Northern Pacific train to Missoula, where he would stand trial, ultimately being acquitted. The Montenegrin population was obviously infuriated at the death of their king, and tensions in town threatened to boil over into a full-blown conflict. Seeing an opportunity to let cooler heads prevail, a delegation of Montenegrins met with the head doctor from the town hospital, who agreed to allow them to bury their king in the cemetery above the hospital. In a massive traditional ceremony attended by more than 1,000 mourners, featuring streamers, lighted tapers, and colorful traditional garb, the king was laid to rest. At the casket, each mourner would stop and kiss the wounds of their king before holding their right hand in the air, swearing to kill the man that had killed him. In the spring, Hayes would return to Taft, believing the Montenegrins had moved on either emotionally or physically. He was wrong. Within minutes of his arrival, an eruption of gunfire could be heard outside town. In the aftermath, Hayes and 2 Montenegrins would be dragged back into town to be laid to rest, with 2 more going unseen in the heavy snow until melt-off a few months later. They would all be buried together in the Taft Town Cemetery under near-identical wooden crosses. The town's tent and wood construction left it particularly susceptible to fire. In the town's 3-year run, it burnt down nearly entirely twice. Fire and property loss being obvious repercussions, this would also inadvertently cause further health issues. The rush to reopen and operate saloons outside typical, albeit loose sanitation norms would spark epidemics of disease. In August of 1908, the newly reconstructed Taft Hospital was filled with people suffering typhoid fever, with the sickness ultimately claiming multiple lives. On April 4, 1909, the St. Paul Tunnel would see its first train pass through, marking the beginning of the inevitable end for Taft. As the massive rail project came to a close, the majority of workers would also move on. By the end of the year, it wouldn't be quite a ghost town, but it was a far cry from its former glory, now boasting only a handful of businesses and saloons. The town would hold on in this fashion for another year, when in the summer of 1910, it fell victim to the Big Burn. Massive wildfires blew up and came together to form one super blaze in August of 1910. Forest rangers arriving to rally citizens to begin taking steps to save the town were appalled to instead find that in the face of possible destruction, the Taft residents would opt instead to drink as much as they possibly could while they waited for death or the rescue train, whatever came first. People tapped into the barrels of whiskey and let the liquor flow. One unfortunate drunkard would manage to set himself on fire in a drunken panic. He was put out and tended to as best as possible, ultimately being wrapped in oiled gauze and put onto a dark train car for transport. A friend of the burnt man climbed into the train car with him before it departed, and struggling to see in the dark, he lit a match to illuminate his surroundings and ignited the oiled gauze covering his burnt brethren. This time the man wouldn't be as lucky, leaving him as Taft's only fatality in the Big Burn. When the smoke finally cleared, it was gone. All the wood buildings were complete losses, and barely anything remained of the once notorious town. Meager attempts to remain were made. The Taft Hotel and Saloon would be rebuilt, but the town would never catch anything more than a few random businesses at a time, spending many years entirely empty. In the 1960s, the Taft Hotel would be demolished to make way for I-90. Today, the area is designated by a freeway exit marked Taft that leads to a sand pile the state uses for road prep. There are no visible signs of the town that once was, but what lies under the surface. Over the years, the town was largely forgotten by most except for locals, and much of the history was forgotten. When railroad historian John Shantz was researching the town in 2018, he found no listed location for the cemetery that served as the final resting place for at least 72 souls. Multiple trips to the town site had proven fruitless, and John turned to the public, hoping oral history may solve that mystery, and he was correct. Butch Jacobson, a local historian, miner, and retired police officer from Mullen, Idaho, would happily come out and share the location as it had been shared with him by the owner of the Taft Saloon when he stopped in for lunch with his father after a successful elk hunt in the mid-1950s. Butch was able to take the team of historians and archaeologists straight to the hillside cemetery, and metal detectors were used to confirm the existence of buttons and buckles buried there, a confirmation of the bodies below. The town's existence was one for a purpose. The railway tunnel the Taft residents dedicated their lives to would continue to see heavy use for both people and freight looking for an easier path through the Continental Divide. The tunnel would serve as rail travel only for 71 years until in 1980 the Milwaukee line abandoned its right-of-way and the tunnel. It would sit unused for over 2 decades before being officially rededicated on June 23, 2001, as part of the route of the Hiawatha Rail Trail. Today the tunnel sees more traffic than ever, with up to 60,000 people passing through each year on foot or bike. The town sees more people passing over it in a day than they would have seen in a year in the early 20th century, but most folks are clueless to the history of the ground they're passing over. The isolated and dangerous town of Taft is now nothing more than a freeway pullout and a salt pile, haunted by the ghost of a town built on spite, sex, and strong whiskey.